Hey, hey, y'all. It's Katie with Arizona Farm Bureau and
Chelsea McGuire, also with Arizona Farm Bureau, and we're back at you with another ag issues webinar.
I know, first of 2023.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Surprise!
Woo! Welcome. Happy New Year.
It feels like it's been a while. I
Yeah.
mean, we were just catching up. You had a lot of stuff going on, and it feels like we're halfway to spring already, but
Yeah,
anyway.
or at least should be.
Hey, and speaking of spring, we're talking about an issue that's, I'm rolling into Easter.
That's right.
Even,
I feel like Easter's a little early this year, right?
It is early. It's early it's in March this year, I think.
Or like 1st of April,
or
maybe.
1st of April.
But yeah. So anyway, the reason we're saying all that is because it's going to be super relevant to our Easter festivities. If eggs continue to be as expensive as they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you guys have all heard about the issues going on with eggs, or maybe not the issues going on with them, but more so that they're just really, really expensive right now. And so that's why I'm super excited to be here with Chelsea today, because she's going to help us understand why the cost of those eggs are so high today.
And it's, I think, important for us to do that because it's really easy to look at something like that and go straight to the source, so to speak, right? Oh my gosh, what are farmers doing? Why is this happening? Wow, they must be making a ton of money. It's not that simple and it's not that clear cut. So today we're just going to go through and we're going to talk about what is happening. We are going to, at the end, have an opportunity to do like the big questions, which we haven't done in a while. And it'll actually be a great lead into a future webinar as well. So we'll get there. But this is a really good one to spark some issues for the actual competition if you want to, but it's also just good information to have in your back pocket when you're talking to your family around the table, strangers in the grocery store, or Fox 10, whatever the case may be. So let's jump right in. I couldn't resist this actually with my favorite comedian. Katie and I are talking about, okay, what do we want to talk? What's important? Okay, how about eggs? Let's just talk about some eggs. But like we said, super relevant, right? Yeah. It's impacting everyone. And I think this is one of those issues that you see it so vibrantly because everyone can relate to it, right? Eggs are a thing that for the most part, we pretty much all buy. And we all remember the last time we went to the store and in our mental budgeting, right? We're like, all right, I'm probably going to pay about $2 for this carton of eggs. And then we see a number that's a whole lot higher than that. And it's a shock to the system, even more so than what we've seen in increases in other places. So why? What is going on? Why are egg prices going through the roof? And I'm not just saying that it's not just anecdotal, right? Although we all have seen it in the grocery store. This is an actual US Bureau of Labor Statistics chart that shows beginning of 2022, we were looking at just under $2 a dozen for your typical grade A large egg. By the end of December, we are at about $4.25 for that same carton of 12 eggs. So again, sometimes these things do just feel anecdotal. This one's definitely not. We've got the numbers to back it up. We've seen what's going on, but the question is why?
Why?
I'm going to boil it down to three things, and they're economics, biology, and policy.
So those all sound like very boring things.
Yes.
But I read ahead for the presentation today, and they're all things we will easily understand.
They are, I promise. We will boil it down as simply and as accessibly as possible, at least I hope. But before I go into any of them, my biggest disclaimer as I've talked about this has been none of these things are really within a farmer's control.
Nope.
So that's an important thing to remember too, right? This is not a situation where we're seeing a seller of eggs going, oh, I'm going to take advantage of something. No, this is us as producers, right? The collective us, trying to deal with the realities that we are facing and that we can't do a whole lot about on our own. So we're going to jump right in. First of all, always. We've all heard that inflation is high right now, right? Because we just got out of an election cycle where that was a huge talking point. We've all seen it in prices, whether it's at the grocery store, whether it's at the car dealer, whether it's at your clothing stores. Everything is more expensive. And so inflation is something that we are dealing with as a nation. I wanted to talk about this because sometimes I think it's one of those obvious things that gets overlooked, right? And to remind us all of what inflation actually is. And it's the loss of the purchase power of your dollar. So when inflation happens, your $1 that was in your pocket buys less tomorrow than it did yesterday, okay? And that's been happening across the spectrum. Also important to note that inflation is one of the key indicators is that things across the economy are rising. So it's not just, there was a freeze and so oranges are now more expensive. It's everything across the spectrum of goods and services that we buy. And agricultural commodities tend to be hit even harder by inflation because unlike a commodity that we think of where it's like, here's a thing and we get it out of the ground, right? Oil or copper or something that is a true commodity, agricultural commodities are actually the result of multiple inputs, right? And that's true in a lot of things too. Copper, you have to have labor and diesel to get it out of the ground, but agricultural commodities uniquely so, when the price of everything else goes up, you're going to see that kind of compounded in an agricultural product. Because when we're talking about eggs, you have to feed those chickens, and you feed those chickens with corn that has to be grown with fertilizer that has been vastly more expensive over the last few years. Then you have to get that corn to the chicken, and that takes diesel. And then you have to get that egg to the store, and that takes diesel. And when all of these costs are rising, the cost of labor also goes up to try to give consumers more dollars in their pocket, since it takes more dollars to buy the same thing. And all of a sudden you have all of these kind of coming and happening at once. And so that end product is just going to cost more to produce. And that's an important point to remember. We're seeing that in everything. Let's not forget that we're going to see that in food prices as well.
And to give you guys an idea of, when Chelsea says fertilizer prices, right? If we take those specifically, because of course that's very important through much of agriculture. So to give you guys an idea of that increase, if you were looking back in, let's say, late 2020, you could pay $450 for a ton of anhydrous ammonia. Then starting in, mid 2022, that went up to $1,600 for that exact same ton.
Yep.
And so that's what we're talking about, these increases in inputs. Think about something you paid $450 for is now $1,600. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
And there's no way to absorb those things. There's no way to overcome. So that's huge.
It's huge. So don't forget that. And don't forget, that's not something that if any farmer can control, right? Economics, inflation are a combination of policies at the federal government level, of spending decisions from consumers. And there's been a lot of upheaval in our economy over the last 2 years, 3 years. So this is something that we're trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out how to absorb it. And I think we're just going to have to be patient. Yep. So that's the economics part of it. Then there's the biology part of it. And this is actually going to factor into economics, right? Because we're going to talk about a little something called supply and demand, but highly pathogenic avian influenza. You might hear it called the bird flu. For some reason, that just rubs me the wrong way. So I'm probably going to call it HPAI most of the time. But this is a highly transmissible virus because we haven't had enough of those lately, needed a few more. And it's bad for chickens. It's bad for birds, as you might get from the name of avian influenza. So what does this do? It causes widespread symptoms among flocks. So you're going to see birds with less energy. They're going to have decreased egg production, coughing, lack of appetite, and sudden death in many cases. And so this is a really serious virus. One, because of the impact it has on birds itself, and two, because it can be transmitted to humans as well. If humans come into contact with infected birds, not with products from infected birds, with the actual infected birds themselves, humans can actually get this virus too. Good news is that so far there's really only been 2 cases of human transmission of the virus. One happened in the United States and one happened in Europe. And both of those cases were from people who were working either directly with the birds. The one in Europe, it was the actual keeper of the flock where it was reported. And in the US, it was someone who was working to depopulate a flock that had been infected with HPAI. So we're not seeing it widespread among humans, but obviously we don't want that to happen. And we don't want it to spread widely among birds either, because that's going to decimate our flocks. We're going to see a huge impact from that. So one, how does it transmit, right? We all know biosecurity in broiler production and egg production is huge. This transmits through wild birds. So you've got an eagle or you've got just a random bird that's flopping around, right? They can transmit it from place to place. And if they're near a commercial flock, that transmission can happen. And that's where this started and then has moved through a lot of those wild or migratory birds to some of our commercial flocks.
Which I think is a good reminder as to why some of the biosecurity and production methods are put in place. There's so much discussion out there about why are animals kept indoors versus outdoors.
That's right.
And this is just a prime example of that being a step that farmers can do to actually protect their animals, right? Where they're outside, they're exposed.
And not only that they can do, but they have to do, right? In a lot of scenarios. So if you look at the chart that's on this PowerPoint slide, you can see numbers, how many commercial poultry we've lost to HPAI in 2022, how much production actually comes from those states, right? So you can see really big producing states and how much they've lost, smaller producing states and how much they've lost. And there's a couple of pieces of good news on this slide. One is that if you look in Arizona, we have
chickenless,
chicken lossless, something like that. We have not had commercial flocks decimated by HPAI. That's very good news. We have had a couple of instances of it in backyard flocks and in wild birds, but nothing that has been widespread or has a big impact on number of chickens in our state. The bad news is, as you look across to where some of the darker colors are, those are some pretty significant poultry producing states. And so you see that there has been, in the Midwest especially, a whole lot of impact from this highly pathogenic avian influenza, and that we have had to depopulate quite a few. When I say depopulate, that's exactly what I mean. If avian influenza is detected in a commercial flock, in a commercial house, you have to get rid of all of those chickens. And it's really, really unfortunate, but that's how you stop it from spreading, right? So you can see where this virus has been concentrated and kind of the concentration versus how much of that state or how big the egg industry or the chicken industry is in that state. One of the questions I get all the time, Arizona hasn't had any bird flu, so why is this impacting us? Well, remember, our food system is a nationwide system, right? We import eggs from other states, Colorado, Minnesota, across the nation. Other states import eggs from other states. We're all very, very connected. So when there's an outbreak in one area of the nation, you're going to see that have an impact on numbers of birds and numbers of bird products or chicken products across the nation. So because of the virus, we've had about 43 million egg-laying hens depopulated across the nation. That's a lot of chickens, which also means that is a whole lot of eggs. And because agriculture is not a factory and you cannot just simply tell that factory to produce more, we're going to take some time before we can repopulate those barns, before we can get those egg laying populations up to where they were before. And so we're going to see a decrease in inventory. We're going to see less supply of eggs because we have fewer chickens that are around to lay those eggs. So this chart shows that the inventory of eggs in the United States decreased by almost 30% if you're comparing December to January. So beginning of the year to end of the year, we have 30% fewer eggs on the market than we should have. That
explains a lot.
Right, explains a lot, because if you've taken Economics 101, you know that as supply goes down, if your demand is going to stay steady, your price is going to go up. And that's the white line on this chart right here. And you can see pretty much a mirror image, right? When egg inventory starts to decrease, that line starts to go up. And that's where you see highly pathogenic avian influenza having probably the biggest, definitely an outsized impact on what's happening in terms of egg prices. We don't have as many eggs in the market. We still need eggs. Eggs are going to be a whole lot more expensive.
Well, and I like that chart because on that chart too, it's showing you the wholesale price, right? So I think that's important to recognize that that's not the price at the store. That's what the retailers are purchasing from the farmers at, which is why when you see that at the $5 range, but then you go to the store and it's cost you $7.
Yeah,
that's where the difference is.
That's where the difference is going to be.
Yeah, important to recognize.
Most definitely.
30%. Whew.
That's a lot.
There's a lot.
It's a big shock to the system. And so, talking shocks to the system, this next thing we're going to talk about on the policy side of things, I want us to keep in mind that we are not saying that the policy we're about to discuss is having a direct impact on egg prices today. What we are saying is that there are things that happen on the market that we can't always predict, right? You can prepare for a disease or a virus outbreak. You can't predict exactly when it's going to happen, and you can't exactly prepare for that and know, oh, I better have 43 million additional hens in just storage.
Hang it out somewhere.
Right. That's not what happens, right? But you do need to have flexibility as an industry. You need to have resiliency as an industry. And industry is able to build some of those things in by doing things like taking advantage of economies of scale, taking advantage of tools that give it greater efficiency and greater production potential. But sometimes our policy doesn't actually match up.
Takes away some of those options.
With that ability.
Yeah.
And that's what we think we are seeing here in Arizona right now. So first of all, Katie, do you know what Seinfeld episode this gift comes from?
No.
Okay, so if you're not a Seinfeld
No.
fan because your high schoolers watching this, and I'm not going to
I'm
say
older. I'm older.
how many years, between that. But this is a Seinfeld episode where Kramer, the crazy haired guy in the gift, decides that he's going to buy a chicken because he wants cage-free farm fresh eggs. And then he buys a rooster. So anyway,
cows in his apartment, no less probably.
in New York.
Yeah.
Correct. Anyway, so in April of 2022, Arizona adopted a cage-free egg rule. We're not the first state to do this, and we're not the first state to struggle with this as well. But the gist of the rule is this. First, there are housing requirements for all chickens that are located here in Arizona. By October of 2022, or that was supposed to be, all hens were required to have 1 square foot of space, 144 inches of space in their cages, as opposed to the between 60 and 70 that they had before. So that's a pretty big increase, right?
Yeah.
About twice the space, which means half the hens. We were supposed to have that in place by October of 2022, but because of the impact of HPAI, pushed back that implementation to this month to give retailers a little more time to be able to source some of these eggs. And then the second aspect is that it requires that all hens be housed in cage-free environments, which is still that 1 square foot of space, but also some changes in the design of the aviaries where they're located, some other things there by 2025. Okay, so that's the housing part of it. But the other aspect of this is that all eggs sold in Arizona, regardless of where they're produced, have to meet those same standards. So if you're buying an egg from Colorado, if you're buying an egg from Minnesota, you have to, as a retailer, certify to the Department of Agriculture, this egg was produced in a way that meets our rules here in Arizona. And if you can't do that, you can't sell that egg. So.
It sounds vaguely familiar to something happening in a neighbor's state.
Indeed, it does sound vaguely familiar to something happening in California, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But Katie, we just had a whole discussion about supply and demand, right? Mm-hmm. And we said that when you can't find eggs to meet your supply, the price is going to go up. Well, what we've done through this rule is we've not only, have to live in this world of inflation and HPAI, but now we can't sell any egg in Arizona. We have to certify that that egg, if we can find it, meets all of these rules. So what we're doing is we're shrinking that supply even more. We're shrinking our universe of possibilities for eggs that can be sold in Arizona, which means that when we have shocks to the system like this, our ability to find margin in that shock has just been eliminated, right? There's a lot of other things I can say too about, consumer choice, and I will say some of those things. But for our discussion right now, the issue is what kind of policy do we want to put on our retailers and on our farmers, and what impact will that have to making sure we have access to affordable food? That's the question, right? That's really where we're kind of going with this. And so when we go to that big question, like I said, this is the first time we've done this in a while, kind of specifically focused on the ag issues competition. But our question is, I'm not asking the humane aspect, right? I'm not asking any of that. I'm asking, should a state be able to impose an animal husbandry standard on producers outside of their state boundaries? That's what Arizona has done through this rule. California really paved the way through Proposition 12, which did this same thing, especially in the pork industry. And there are 2 schools of thought, a yes and a no, which makes this really easy.
Novel.
Okay, so the first, yes, absolutely, states should be able to do this. as a state, you have the obligation to keep your citizens safe and to keep them healthy. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that they have access to things that are produced the way you want them to be produced, which means that that's going to be consistent with your moral standards and your ethical standards, right? That's one of the big arguments that the proponents of these kinds of rules are putting into play. Also, let's say, okay, Colorado doesn't want to comply with our rules. It's probably a bad example because they have a cage-free rule too. Minnesota doesn't want to comply with our rules. Minnesota doesn't have to sell eggs here, right? There are 48 other states that they can choose if they want to sell eggs to. Okay, that's fair, right? That's market choice, whatever. Here's the flip side of that argument. One, if you allow one state to impose a production restriction on all other states, what happens to the sovereignty of those other states, right? Why should California be able to tell Iowa how to produce its pork? Why should Arizona be able to tell Minnesota how to produce its eggs? If you want to have interstate commerce, you should be able to, and Congress does. It's within the Constitution, right? That Congress has the ability to regulate commerce among the states. It's something that we want. Should one state be able to impede that? There are many, including us, who would argue that no, that's not the case. The second aspect, kind of that, if you don't want to comply, consumers can vote with their dollars, right? The state absolutely has an obligation to stop someone from intentionally harming somebody. But if there's a consumer that says, you know what, I think that this method of production is more humane, I think that it creates a superior product, and therefore that's what I'm going to buy,
Then buy it.
Then they get to buy that. They get to vote with their dollar. What this has done is it has locked every consumer into a premium product, right? It has locked every consumer into that choice, irrespective of whether that consumer can afford that choice or wants to make that choice. Now it's the only one that they have. So this is a really big question.
And with no science behind putting that forward. I mean, there's nothing to say that the food is safer or more nutritious or the animal is safer or better treated in these things. None of it's based on science. It's all very opinionated in the first place. So it's very interesting.
It is. And so the reason I'm being maybe a little bit vague on this big question is that this is an actual question before the United States Supreme Court right now. In October, the court heard argument on California's Proposition 12, which, as we've said, imposes similar restrictions on the pork industry. California kind of set this up perfectly because California only produces 0.03% of pork in the United States, but consumes like 47% or something around those lines. So what this really means is that California just told Iowa how it needs to. Everything. That's right. Iowa, North Carolina, right? That's who's going to have to follow this California rule. So the court's going to answer this question. Should states be able to do this? Is this constitutional? Is it a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause? Is it a violation of how our system of commerce is supposed to work? They heard argument on that in October, and the courts, it was a very interesting argument. I don't anticipate that this is going to be an easy decision for them to write. But once it comes out, Katie and I are going to do a deep dive into Prop 12. It is like the perfect intersection of our two departments.
Yeah,
I'm real excited to nerd out about this. So you guys are going to get a crash course in how SCOTUS works, and you're going to get a crash course in what appeals mean and how all the stuff.
You need to help them because you just lost them because you said SCOTUS.
I didn't say that already. SCOTUS is Supreme Court of the United States.
There you go.
Just like POTUS is President of the United States, SCOTUS is Supreme Court. So
welcome to my life, people.
She complains and she loves it. So we're going to do a whole deep dive into that where, we'll be able to go into how did the Supreme Court answer this question, but it'll still be a great option if you want to use something like this for your ag issues competition. But it is also just a really important discussion to have generally, because these are the kinds of questions that we're answering with our consumer dollars and that we're answering with our votes as well, right? So think about this. That's been my sort of call to the consumer. When these kinds of questions come up, whether it's at a ballot initiative, whether you're talking to elected officials or deciding who you're going to vote for, think about what kind of food system we want. What kinds of redundancies and resiliencies do we want built into our food system to respond to shocks to the system that we have no control over? And how do we weigh the kind of production that we want, or what we want production to look like, and what we want our food to cost, and how available we want that food to be? I don't want that to be like a flippant question, right? Because it actually is a legitimate question. What are the ethics and morals that we want to follow? And how do we decide what is ethical and moral? And how do we decide the best way to make food affordable? And how do we balance those things? It's what farmers are doing every single day. And it's what consumers are now having a more and more opportunity to do with their purchasing power and their policy decisions.
Mhm.
So I like this one.
I like this
I
one.
like this
too.
one.
So
So
we
that's
won't get a ton into this question, but I do have a question for you because
Yeah.
I'm sure that our friends out there are thinking about it. And we'll get into it more when the decision comes
Yeah.
on Prop 12. But, you know, so we're saying what those policies are in place for Arizona, right? So now we've moved to this month for the 1 square foot, and then it's gonna be 2025 for the cage free. So what happens with Prop 12 if the Supreme Court comes and says, California, you can't do that?
Mhm.
What is that sort of waterfall effect then to things that we have here or other states
Yeah.
maybe have already been putting in place?
So it's a good question. And it's actually one of the reasons that so many people have been paying attention to Proposition 12. So in the legal kind of structure, until a court rules that something is unconstitutional, it's on the books, right? So right now, Prop 12 is on the books. There are some things that are being enforced, some things that aren't. But as of right now, no one has said, hey, California, you can't enforce that rule. The court could come down with that decision in March or April and say, California, that is unconstitutional. You cannot enforce the law. You got to take it off your books and you can't do anything about it. That doesn't automatically mean that if another state has the same thing, that other state's law is invalidated. The state
But they
can say that,
could.
right? But
Okay.
ultimately what's probably going to happen is somebody in that state has to step up and
Lawsuit.
say, hey, I am impacted by this rule. The Supreme Court has said this rule is unconstitutional, and they will have to go to a court in that state to get it taken off the books. That's usually kind of the, weirdly enough, the fastest or easiest way to do that when you have really clear Supreme Court precedent that says this thing cannot happen, and if it's happening, we're going to take it off. You know, another way to do that would be to go to the legislature of that state if it's a statutory rule and say, hey, the Supreme Court just said this is unconstitutional. You should probably pass a bill taking it off of our laws. So there are multiple ways to do that, but someone will have to start that. Someone has to be the catalyst. It's not just going to happen automatically.
And it's important that we, you know, I mean, you've encouraged as people are going and voting on these policies and things, whether you can now or later. You have to not look at like, oh, well, so Prop 12 can undo what
Yeah.
they did. Because when you're looking at a state like Arizona, so let's take, for instance, the egg policy. It has to be transitioned by 2025,
Right.
which means our egg producers have already been started doing that. So even if that rule got by 2025,
That's a technical term. by the way.
yes, our producers are going to be doing just cage free because they had to have time to adjust and they want to be able to sell their product.
Yeah.
So in the end, I mean, would you say that the damage for that is kind of already done, but maybe it'll stop future ones from going forward?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to look at it. One, it stops sort of that incentive structure that a lot of the more radical groups have used to say, hey, we're going to force this down in one state where it could be easy to get it done, and then that has the waterfall effect in other states, right? But specific to eggs and specific to Arizona egg producers, they're not going to wait, right? And
Right.
see whether this is going to happen. They have to start making investments now, very, very real investments of financial capital and, you know, everything that it takes to make these very expensive transitions. So yeah, I think you're right in terms of what the impact and what it will cost our producers. The damage is done the moment that you mandate it, regardless of how long that stays on the books and in what form it stays on the books. But when you see the future and when you
Right.
see resiliency being able to go to maybe to other states, right? Or having options
Those
that are
bigger
more
ones that
affordable.
are producing more of those
That's
things,
right.
because then Arizona could purchase those perhaps.
Arizona could purchase those, and Arizona producers can still take advantage of those consumers that do want to buy that
Yep.
product, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that want to make that change, and that's the choice they want to make. Absolutely. Continue to take advantage of that. There are restaurant chains, there are even retail chains that have said this is what we're going to source. 100% continue to take advantage of that. But it's a definite possibility that the court will give consumers back some of that power.
Gotcha. Which is, I think, what everybody wants, right?
It's certainly what we want.
Yeah. So it means we have to read what these things mean.
That's right.
And not just the title, perhaps, when we go to
That is
the voting polls.
correct.
Listen
So,
to the rhetoric.
so I did just stop screen sharing, but we do have a resources slide that's up on the PowerPoint that you will have access to. It's got a couple links to articles that I think are helpful, both from American Farm Bureau and Arizona Farm Bureau. And then some of the resources that I used for the charts and some of the numbers on this, a really interesting study from Purdue University. Okay, maybe I'm the only one that's going to think it's interesting, but a good study in just farm input prices and inflation trends and how those two things are different, and farm input prices tend to inflate higher than general inflation. So just some food for thought, things to take a look at.
Food for thought.
That's what we
I
should
just
call
like
these
that.
webinars.
It's 2023. We can make a
We can
change.
make all kinds of changes.
So tune in next month for food for thought.
Here we go.
But I think we're talking about water.
Well,
So
that's
still food
very
for
important.
thought. That's
Water
right.
equals food, my friends.
Water does equal food. So, all right. Well, thanks as always for tuning in, Chelsea. Thanks so much for your time and knowledge and input for today. And we'll see you guys next month.
See you later.